April 22nd, 1889. The frontier stands on the edge of chaos. Hooves pound the dry earth, wagons rattle, men shout, and dust, thick as a storm, rises over the prairie. Welcome to the Oklahoma Land Rush, the greatest race in American history. At the stroke of noon, a stampede of 50,000 people will surge forward, desperate for a stake in the promised land. Some will find fortune, others will find failure, and some will take what isn't theirs. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, 6 land rushes would carve Oklahoma into existence. They would attract pioneers, outlaws, dreamers, and speculators. The land would shape them, and they would shape history. This is the story of how a raw and untamed frontier became a state. A story of ambition, deception, and resilience. This is the story of the land rushes that made Oklahoma. Chapter 1. The Unassigned Lands. Before 1889, the land that would become Oklahoma was home to the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. These nations had once lived in the southeastern United States until the Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced them on a brutal march westward, an ordeal known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands perished along the way, but those who survived rebuilt their lives in what was then called Indian Territory. They established schools, governments, and prosperous communities. By the late 19th century, the frontier was vanishing, and the American hunger for land was insatiable. The tribes had been granted large tracts, but not all of it had been settled. One stretch of land in particular, the so-called unassigned lands, became the focus of national debate. Nearly 2 million acres sat in the heart of Indian Territory, seemingly unoccupied. The U.S. government argued that because these lands had not been formally assigned to any particular tribe, they were open for redistribution. But the reality was far more complex. The origins of the unassigned lands traced back to the Civil War. During the war, the 5 civilized tribes had been forced to take sides. Some sided with the Confederacy, others with the Union, and some simply tried to survive the chaos. When the war ended, the federal government saw an opportunity. In a series of treaties signed in 1866, Washington punished those tribes that had supported the Confederacy by seizing large portions of their land. These treaties carved out the unassigned lands, land that had once belonged to the Creek and Seminole, but was now held in limbo, neither fully Indian nor fully available for white settlement. The government claimed these lands were empty, but they were not. Native communities still hunted and traveled through them, seeing them as part of their broader territory. Freedmen, formerly enslaved people who had found refuge among the tribes after the war, had begun to settle in parts of the land. And some tribal leaders, recognizing the growing pressure from Washington, fought to retain control, proposing to lease the land to railroads or sell it on their own terms. But to Washington lawmakers, railroad tycoons, and land-hungry settlers, these details mattered little. They saw only opportunity. Railroad companies, eager to expand their networks, lobbied for settlement. Farmers in Kansas and Texas, their eyes set on new fertile soil, clamored for access. Speculators dreamed of new towns springing up overnight, ripe for investment. The fight over these lands was not just legal, but ideological. For decades, America had been moving westward, seizing land, building railroads, and displacing those who had come before. Now, the last great frontier was opening, not through war or treaty, but through sheer speed. The battle over Oklahoma had begun. Chapter 2. The Boomers and David L. Payne. The push to open Oklahoma was championed by a man named David L. Payne, a former Union soldier turned land boomer. A restless frontiersman with a gift for persuasion, Payne saw the unassigned lands not as a legal boundary, but as an untapped opportunity. He believed the land belonged to the people, and he intended to claim it, whether Washington agreed or not. Starting in the late 1870s, Payne led illegal settlement expeditions deep into Oklahoma territory, bringing wagon loads of hopeful settlers eager to stake their claims. They built makeshift camps, planted crops, and declared their right to stay. Each time, the U.S. Army arrived to remove them, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force. The settlers were marched back across the Kansas border, their cabins burned to the ground. But Payne was undeterred. as this newspaper article from July 31st, 1884 illustrates.
Oklahoma. Payne has begun his annual monkeying around in the Indian Territory. He and his associate squatters have been ordered by the government to vacate the lands of the Cherokees, which they have taken possession of. The military will enforce the order and arrest all the trespassers. The government has been fooling with these cranks long enough, and they should be taught a severe lesson this time.
To Payne, every eviction was another headline, another rallying cry. He flooded newspapers with passionate arguments, calling the government's refusal to open Oklahoma a betrayal of American ideals. He printed pamphlets, organized public meetings, and turned the cause into a movement. His followers became known as boomers, their numbers swelling with every year. Washington took notice. Railroad companies, desperate for settlement along their tracks, threw their support behind Payne's cause. Newspapers fueled public outrage, calling for an end to what they saw as wasted land. Under growing pressure, Congress debated, was it time to open Oklahoma? Then, in 1884, Payne's crusade came to an abrupt end. While organizing another expedition, he was arrested and charged with violating federal law. But before he could stand trial, he suddenly collapsed and died of a heart attack. He was 52 years old. William Couch, once Payne's lieutenant, took up the mantle, not as a firebrand, but as a strategist. Where Payne had relied on spectacle, Couch worked the legal system, pressing Washington until it could no longer ignore the growing movement. Finally, in March 1889, President Benjamin Harrison signed the Indian Appropriations Act, authorizing the opening of the unassigned lands to white settlement. The date was set, April 22nd, 1889.
Building westward.
The final nights before the rush were filled with restless anticipation. By firelight, men studied maps, sharpening stakes that would mark their claims. Wives prepared food that might last through days of hardship. Children whispered questions no one could yet answer. Would their fathers win land, or would they return empty-handed? Would the land be fair, or would it already be claimed? Chapter 3, The Great Land Rush of 1889. As dawn broke on April 22nd, 1889, a restless sea of humanity stretched along the border of the unassigned lands. Farmers, cowboys, merchants, widows, ex-soldiers, all waiting, watching. The stakes were clear. 160 acres of free land, granted under the Homestead Act, to anyone who could claim it first. But the stakes were more than just land. Many settlers had already sold their homes, packed their entire lives into wagons, and risked everything for a chance at a new start. For them, this was not just a race, it was a fight for survival. At precisely noon, a gunshot rang out. The race was on. Men on horseback surged forward, wagon wheels dug deep into the earth, and dust swallowed the horizon. It was a chaotic, frenzied rush, one of the most dramatic moments in American history.
At the stroke of noon, the whole world seemed to explode into motion. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, desperate to find my piece of land before another man did. I saw a man fall from his horse. He did not get up. Another's wagon broke apart, but he ran forward, his family trailing behind. There was no mercy in the rush, only hunger.
By nightfall, Oklahoma City had risen from nothing, a city built in a day. 10,000 people poured into the open prairie, staking claims, erecting tents, and hammering boards into makeshift homes. Campfires dotted the landscape, and the sounds of saws and hammers filled the air.
Where yesterday the wild grasses swayed, today stands a town. Wagons turned into storefronts, cloth roofs stretched over wooden frames. The people call it Oklahoma City, but what it truly is an eruption of human ambition.
But as the dust settled, the fight for Oklahoma had only just begun. Chapter 4, The Boomtowns and the Sooners. It was not just Oklahoma City that was born that day. Other boomtowns like Guthrie sprang up just as rapidly. Guthrie, the designated territorial capital, saw an even greater explosion of settlement. In the first 6 hours, it transformed from empty prairie into a fully functioning town of 15,000 people. Residents hastily set up banks, general stores, and even a newspaper, the Guthrie Daily News, which printed its first edition within 24 hours of the rush. But these were towns only in name. With no official surveys or civic planning, claims overlapped, and entire streets were built on contested land. The first banks operated from tents, and courtrooms were nothing more than open fields with crates for benches. In Guthrie, 4 rival town sites sprang up side by side, each with its own mayor, its own ordinances, and its own street map. Some streets crossed at odd angles, others disappeared altogether. For weeks, no one could even agree on where Main Street was. Saloons were among the first businesses to open their doors, followed closely by land offices, where settlers lined up to file their claims. But within hours, disputes broke out. Many settlers found that the best lots had already been taken. The land rush had been meant as a fair race, but not all had played by the rules. They were called Sooners, those who had slipped past patrols, hidden in gullies, and staked their claims before the official start. Some were scouts hired by speculators, others were railroad employees who had jumped off passing trains, and a few were even government officials who used inside knowledge to grab prime locations. But how did someone actually claim a piece of land? Under the rules of the Homestead Act, simply arriving first wasn't enough. Settlers had to physically mark their claim, often by hammering a wooden post into the ground, planting flags at the corners of their 160-acre parcel, or scrawling their name on a board. These makeshift markers served as a public notice. This land is taken. But staking a claim was just the beginning. To make it legal, the settler then had to leave the land and travel to the nearest federal land office, often miles away in Guthrie, Kingfisher, or Stillwater. There, they would file a homestead entry application, swear under oath that they had not entered the land early, and pay a small registration fee. Speed was everything. If 2 people claimed the same parcel, the one who filed first at the land office usually won, regardless of who physically reached it first. The result was chaos. Some claims were registered multiple times. Others were jumped, stolen, or lost in a bureaucratic tangle of paperwork. One case, United States versus Thomas Snead, dragged on for nearly a decade. Snead had staked a claim before the legal start and refused to surrender it, arguing that he had been given unofficial permission by a land office clerk. The courts ruled against him, but by then, he had already sold the land for a fortune and vanished into history. Journal entry.
The cries of "Sooner, sooner," rang out in the night, followed by gunfire. 2 men argued over a corner lot, and by dawn, one was dead. The land rush was over, but the lawlessness had only begun.
The widespread presence of Sooners led to legal chaos. By 1892, over 5,000 land claims had been contested. One of the most significant cases, Smith versus Townsend, 1893, set a legal precedent. Alexander Smith, a railroad worker, had camped at Edmond Station before the legal opening. After the rush, he claimed a quarter section of land. But another settler, Eddie Townsend, had followed the rules and contested the claim. The Supreme Court sided with Townsend, ruling that any advantage gained before the official signal invalidated the claim. Justice Henry Brown wrote that the government could not condone rule breakers, lest the entire process collapse into fraud and favoritism. The man tasked with bringing Sooners to justice was Attorney William F. Harn, appointed by the Department of the Interior. Harn investigated false filings, illegal entries, and speculative fraud. He spent years untangling claims, often battling well-connected speculators and corrupt clerks. Some Sooners were stripped of their land. Others, like Snead, escaped with their profits before rulings were handed down. In many towns, settlers formed vigilance committees to enforce their own rules. With no police or courts in place, justice was improvised. In Oklahoma City, 2 rival townsite companies laid out overlapping street grids, and both claimed authority. In Guthrie, the first courtroom was a tent, the second was a bar room. Disputes over land turned into duels of paperwork, or sometimes revolvers. Judges were elected by popularity, and sheriffs were often chosen for their muscle, not their legal acumen. Yet somehow, order began to emerge. For every winner of the land rush, there were thousands of losers.
Hope ran high among these settlers that this new land would bring them wealth and security. But for many enthusiastic pioneers, hope would turn to disappointment.
Many who had traveled for weeks arrived too late, left with nothing but dust and disappointment. One letter from a Kansas farmer tells the story.
Every inch of bottom land was occupied by squatters, and the farther we rode along the riverbank, the more of these men we met. The best land we could get was so sandy and red that you could not grow beans on it unless it rained twice a week all through the season. We came on here to rest up and shall not go back. I wouldn't live on such land a month.
Yet many did not leave. Those who could not claim land often stayed to build businesses, offer services, or farm rented land. Black families fleeing Jim Crow persecution founded their own communities across Oklahoma, including the all-black town of Langston. Immigrants from Germany, Bohemia, and Poland brought trades and languages from Europe and stitched their lives into the new patchwork of the territory.
Activity became feverish. Homes had to be built. The land had to be tilled. Men and women alike went to work to cut, saw, and build their crude cabins, each helping the other in a spirit of cooperation.
Within a year, Oklahoma City boasted banks, schools, and even an opera house. Guthrie, once a patch of grassland, now had brick buildings, streetlights, and a population rivaling any city in the region. Oklahoma had been won in a single day, but the struggle to keep it had only begun.
The towering Rocky Mountains ran north and south across the West, dividing it into two basic regions. East of the Rockies was the extensive region of the Great Plains. Much of this was a great flat prairie land of grass. The geography of the West was not encouraging to settlers. Also discouraging was the menace of the Indians, fierce hunters and warriors who would resist the loss of their hunting grounds to settlers. Yet, despite the formidable geography of the region and its fierce inhabitants, settlers would be drawn to the West.
Chapter 5: The Native Perspective. While thousands of settlers raced to claim their piece of Oklahoma, another group watched in silence. For the Native American tribes of the region, the land rush was not a new beginning. It was an ending. The lands they had been promised forever were now being stripped away, piece by piece. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, had once controlled vast territories in the southeast. But in the 1830s, they were forcibly removed from their homelands in what became known as the Trail of Tears. White Eagle was the hereditary chief of the Ponca Indians. He left a narrative of the Ponca removal from their lands along Nebraska's Niobrara River. He said, in part, "The soldiers forced us across the Niobrara, just as one would drive a herd of ponies. And so, I reached the warm land, Oklahoma. We found the land there was bad, and we were dying, one after another, and our animals died, and it was very hot. This land is truly sickly, and we hope the Great Father will take us back home again." That is what we said. There were 100 of us who died there. Thousands died on the journey, but those who survived rebuilt their nations in Indian territory, creating schools, governments, and prosperous towns. In their treaties with the U.S. government, they were assured that this land would remain theirs forever. But after the Civil War, those promises unraveled. The federal government punished tribes that had allied with the Confederacy by seizing millions of acres of their land. By the late 19th century, Indian Territory had become a target for expansion. Through the Dawes Act of 1887, tribal lands were divided into individual allotments, and whatever land remained was declared surplus, open to white settlement. The unassigned lands, the focal point of the land rush, were just the beginning. But it was not just land that was taken. The government sought to dismantle Native culture itself. Thousands of Native children were sent to boarding schools, forced to cut their hair, speak English, and abandon their traditions. The land rush was only one part of a larger effort to erase their identity. Many tribal leaders fought to stop the seizure of their lands, taking their case to Washington, but the tide of settlers was too strong, and the government was unwilling to listen.
My hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you also feel pain. The blood that flows from mine will be the same color as yours. The Great Spirit made us both. Chief Standing Bear, speaking in U.S. District Court, 1879.
But the pleas were ignored. The land rush went forward, and in the years that followed, more land runs, lotteries, and forced allotments would carve Oklahoma into smaller and smaller pieces, leaving native nations struggling to maintain what little sovereignty they had left. Today, the nations of Oklahoma still stand. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole have rebuilt, preserving their cultures and identities against all odds. But the land rush left a wound that never fully healed. For settlers, it was the birth of a new state. For Native peoples, it was yet another chapter in a long history of loss. Chapter 6. The Later Land Rushes. The land rush of 1889 was only the beginning. The overwhelming success of the first race fueled demand for more, and over the next 15 years, the federal government opened millions of additional acres for settlement. The Cheyenne-Arapaho lands in 1892, the Cherokee Outlet in 1893, the Kickapoo lands in 1895, the Big Pasture in 1906. The largest land rush came in 1893, the Cherokee Outlet. Over 100,000 settlers lined up for 8 million acres, making it the most massive race for land in American history. But unlike 1889, this time the government tried to impose order. Settlement was to be organized into larger townships, with designated sections for commerce, homes, and industry. The result: even more chaos. As thousands of riders charged forward, wagons overturned, men were trampled, and dust storms blinded those in the frenzy. One Kansas journalist called it the most dangerous race ever run on American soil.
We saw bodies on the road, horses broken and useless. Some men claimed land, some fell under their wagons. My brother went for land near Enid. We have not heard from him since.
Despite the risks, the rushes continued. By 1906, Oklahoma's landscape had been carved into townships, homesteads, and counties, with barely any tribal land left untouched. A frontier that had once been Indian territory was now filling with banks, railroads, and schools. Chapter 7. Oklahoma becomes a state. By 1907, Oklahoma had changed forever. The Boomtowns had settled, railroads connected distant frontiers, and a new generation was shaping the land. The rushes had drawn over 1 million new settlers, and the demand for statehood was undeniable. On November 16, 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the proclamation admitting Oklahoma as the 46th state. The wild frontier had become a part of the Union. The dream of the land rush had built a new society, but it had also left scars on the people who came, on those who were displaced, and on the land itself. For the settlers who had raced for land, the dust of the rush had settled, but the memory of it never faded. Some built lasting legacies, others lost everything, and for the native nations, Oklahoma would remain a symbol of promises broken and land taken. Today, the prairies of Oklahoma still whisper the stories of those who came before, the pioneers who braved the unknown, the indigenous peoples who lost their homeland, the dreamers who risked everything for a piece of the American dream.
A frontier people had remade a continent. Virtually all productive land had been put to the plow. The trees of the forests were cut and sawed into lumber for millions of homes. This land had become a great nation, the United States of America.
The dust of the land rush has settled, but its echoes still whisper across the land. Some see it as a triumph, others as a tragedy. But the hunger for a new beginning, that drive, that desperation, is woven into the very fabric of America. This was the last frontier. This was the land rush that made Oklahoma. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, or even sharing it with someone who might find it interesting. And let me know what you think in the comments. Your feedback and suggestions mean a lot. I'll see you in the next one.